The night the storm came down over Ashworth like a collapsing roof, nobody thought to count the children first. Duke Gabriel Ashworth had ridden 3 hours through sleet that cut like glass, his greatcoat frozen stiff against his shoulders, calling a name into a darkness that swallowed every sound but the wind. Evelyn, his wife of 4 years, Duchess of Ashworth, gone from the manor since dusk, and no one, not the stable boy, not the housekeeper, not the vicar's wife who had seen her last near the crossroads, could say where. By midnight, half the village of Thornbury had joined the search with lanterns that guttered and drowned in the wet. By 2 a.m, Gabriel's horse had gone lame in a rut hidden beneath new snow, and he had continued on foot, his boots filling with ice water, his voice a ruin in his throat. It was the smell that stopped him. Not wood smoke, char. Old char, the kind that clings to timber long after the fire has died, mixed now with wet ash and something sharper underneath it, something that made his stomach drop before his mind understood why. The old orphanage at Blackmere Hollow. Condemned 2 winters past after half its roof caved in a windstorm, the children moved to the parish house in town, or so everyone had believed. Everyone, it seemed, except 12 small souls who had slipped through the cracks of that arrangement, and 1 woman who had apparently known it. Gabriel pushed through a door hanging by a single hinge, into a building that should have been empty, should have been forgotten, should not have held the sight now in front of him. Evelyn lay on the floor of what had once been a nursery, her cloak, his mother's cloak, the deep blue wool she had worn to their wedding, spread wide like a second roof over as many small bodies as it could cover. Where the cloak ended, her own arms began, wrapped around 2 boys who could not have been older than 6. Her dress, beneath it, was soaked through and had frozen stiff at the hem. Her lips had a color he did not want to name. Around her, tucked into the lee of a broken wall where the wind could not reach, 12 children slept in a tangle of small limbs and shared warmth, their breath rising in pale clouds, every single one of them alive. Evelyn. His voice broke on the second syllable. He was on his knees before he knew he had moved, his frozen hands finding her face, her throat, searching for a pulse he was terrified he would not find. Her eyes opened, slowly, as though the effort cost her something she could not easily afford to spend. Gabriel. A whisper, nothing more. You have to be quiet. I only just got the youngest one to sleep. He let out a sound that was half a laugh and half something closer to breaking, and gathered her against him, cloak and children and all, as though he could pour the last of his own warmth directly into her through the sheer force of holding on. How long? He managed. How long have you been here? Since before the storm came in. Her teeth had begun to chatter now that someone else had arrived to notice the cold on her behalf. I found them 3 days ago, Gabriel. Living here. No one had told anyone. No one had counted them at all. 3 days. Not one night lost to a search party's ignorance, but 3 days of a secret she had carried alone, into a storm that had nearly buried her with it. Why didn't you send word to me? Evelyn's eyes, even now, even half frozen and swaying with exhaustion, held the particular steadiness he had fallen in love with 4 years ago, in a ballroom neither of them had wanted to attend. Because the last time I told you something inconvenient about this estate, she said, you told me it wasn't a lady's concern. So I decided not to make it a request this time. I decided to make it a fact you would have to walk into. Gabriel went very still, the cold in the room suddenly feeling like the smallest of his problems. Because she was right. Because 6 months ago, in his own study, over his own ledgers, he had said almost exactly that, and he had not thought of it since, while she, apparently, had thought of nothing else. Behind them, one of the children stirred, whimpering at the cold air let in by the broken door, and Evelyn's whole body turned toward the sound, before her own shivering had even finished, an instinct so immediate and complete that Gabriel understood in that frozen ruin of a nursery, that he had married a woman he had not yet troubled himself to fully know. "There will be time for all of that," she whispered, already reaching to resettle the cloak. "Once we get them somewhere warm. All 12 of them, Gabriel. Not 11 you can quietly forget by spring." He looked past her, at the small sleeping faces catching the first gray edge of dawn through the broken roof, and felt the shape of the next weeks. The parish, the estate, his own mother's expectations for that cloak in this house, rearrange itself entirely around a decision his wife had apparently already made 3 days before he had even noticed she was gone. The children did not wake all at once. They surfaced in stages, the way frightened animals do, one small head lifting to check whether the danger of the night before had followed them into morning. Then another, until Evelyn Ashworth found herself the center of 12 pairs of eyes far too old for the faces that held them. She knew each name already. She had spent 3 days learning them, one by one, coaxed out between offerings of bread she had smuggled from the manor's kitchens in the folds of her cloak. Margaret, the eldest at perhaps 11, who had appointed herself second mother to the group with a fierceness that made her seem older still. The twins, Thomas and Toby, who did not speak but communicated in a private language of glances that Evelyn had given up trying to decode. Little Alice, not yet 4, who had cried without sound for the entire first day, and had only stopped when Evelyn began humming the same lullaby, over and over, until the tune had worn a groove into the girl's fear. And Daniel, 12 years old, the newest arrival among them, who watched Gabriel now with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but something suspended uneasily between the two. "You're the Duke," the boy said. It was not a question. "I am." Gabriel had shed his frozen greatcoat and wrapped it, still faintly warm from his own body, around the shoulders of the smallest child he could reach. "And you are all coming to Ashworth House this morning, every one of you, and there will be no discussion of alternatives." Margaret's chin lifted with the particular defiance of a girl who had been disappointed by adults before. "The parish said there was no room." "The parish," Gabriel said, "will not be making that decision again." It should have been simple after that. It was not. By the time the children were fed, warmed, and settled into the east wing of Ashworth House, a wing that had stood empty since Gabriel's own childhood, its dust sheets pulled away by servants too startled by the Duke's uncharacteristic urgency to ask why, the true shape of the difficulty had begun to reveal itself, and it had nothing to do with beds or bread. It had to do with a ledger. Gabriel found it in his study that afternoon, the very book he had once waved at Evelyn as proof that estate matters were beyond her concern, and it told him what she, apparently, had already discovered 3 days before wandering into Blackmere Hollow in the first place. The old orphanage had not closed for want of a roof. It had closed because the funds allocated to its upkeep, funds his own late father had settled upon the parish decades before, and which Gabriel had continued without ever once reviewing the particulars, had quietly stopped reaching it 18 months prior. Someone had been diverting them. "You knew," he said, when he found Evelyn in the east wing, kneeling on the floor beside Alice with a hairbrush, working gently through a tangle the girl had clearly not allowed anyone to touch in weeks. "About the money." I suspected. She did not look up. "I asked Mr. Pratchett, your steward, 3 months ago why the orphanage accounts hadn't been settled at quarter day. He told me it wasn't a lady's concern." The echo of his own words, delivered back to him a second time in one day, landed harder than the first. "And you let it go." I let him think I had. Evelyn set the brush down and finally met his eyes, and there was something in her expression that was not quite triumph, but close enough to unsettle him. "Gabriel, I have spent 4 years being told which parts of this house, this estate, this marriage were mine to know about. I decided some months ago that I would simply stop asking permission to know things and start finding them out instead. It was, Gabriel realized with the particular vertigo of a man discovering he has been standing on ground far less solid than he believed, an entirely reasonable position. It was also, quietly, a small revolution that had been happening beneath his own roof for months without his notice. Pratchett, he said slowly, turning the name over like a stone he suspected held something unpleasant beneath it. You think he took the funds? I think, Evelyn said, that a man who has managed this estate for 11 years does not simply forget an orphanage exists. I think he counted on you never reviewing a single line of that ledger yourself, because you had made it very clear, on more than one occasion, that you trusted him entirely and found the details tedious. Gabriel opened his mouth to object, and found to his considerable discomfort that he could not. Because it was true. He had trusted Pratchett the way a man trusts a chair he has sat in 1,000 times without inspecting the joints, not from any real evidence of soundness, but from sheer accumulated habit. And in that trust, 12 children had nearly frozen to death in a building he had believed was empty, while his wife had gone looking for the truth alone, in a storm. Rather than bring him a suspicion, he might have waved away as he had waved away so much else. There's something else, Evelyn said, and now there was a hesitation in her voice that had not been there before, a carefulness that made Gabriel's stomach tighten in anticipation of a second blow following hard on the first. Daniel, the eldest boy, he isn't from the parish register at all. I checked this morning, before you woke. There's no record of him ever being admitted to Blackmere Hollow. No record of his parents, nothing. Margaret says he arrived only 4 months ago, in the middle of the night, brought by a man in a good coat who told them all he'd pay for the boy's keep and never come back to check on it. Gabriel felt the ledger's small betrayal reshape itself into something considerably larger. A man in a good coat. Margaret didn't see his face clearly, but she remembers the ring he wore. She described it to me this morning, before I understood why my hands had gone cold listening to her. Evelyn's gaze did not waver from his. A signet ring, Gabriel. Gold, with a hawk in flight. The Ashworth family crest had worn a hawk in flight for 6 generations. Gabriel sat with that single fact for the length of one long, terrible breath, and then he was moving, down the stairs, through the corridor, calling for Pratchett in a voice that brought 2 housemaids scurrying out of his path before he had even reached the study door. Pratchett was not there. Pratchett, the housekeeper reported with visible unease, had ridden out at first light, before the household had properly woken, taking the estate's second-best horse and telling no one his destination. He knew, Evelyn said quietly, from the doorway behind Gabriel. Someone must have sent word last night that you'd found the children. He knew what that would mean once you looked at the ledger. Gabriel's hand closed hard around the edge of his desk. 11 years of trust, and the man had run at the first true test of it, which told him, more clearly than any confession could have, exactly how much guilt Pratchett carried. But it was not Pratchett's ring that Margaret had described. A steward, however corrupt, did not wear a signet with the Ashworth hawk. Only family wore that ring. Only 3 people, in fact, in the whole of England. Gabriel himself, his late father before him, and his younger brother Edmund, who had been given his own smaller version of it on his 21st birthday, and had not set foot at Ashworth House in over a year. Edmund? Gabriel said, the name tasting strange and cold in his mouth. I didn't want to believe it either. Evelyn crossed the room and set her hand over his on the desk, and he realized only then how badly it had begun to shake. But it fits, doesn't it? He's been in debt since the spring. You told me so yourself, though you didn't tell me how deep. And a boy hidden away with no parish record, kept quiet with money that was supposed to go to an orphanage no one was meant to remember still existed. Say it. I think Daniel is his son. The words landed exactly as heavily as Gabriel had feared they would, and yet, once spoken, they arranged a dozen small strangenesses of the past year into a single, coherent, damning shape. Edmund's sudden need for funds that never seemed to resolve however much Gabriel advanced him. Edmund's visits to Thornbury, ostensibly to see friends from his university days. Friends Gabriel had never once been able to name when asked. Edmund's absence, entire and unexplained, from the family Christmas gathering 4 months past. Precisely, Gabriel now realized with a cold drop in his chest, when Margaret said the boy had first arrived at Blackmere Hollow in the middle of the night. If it's true, Gabriel said slowly, then Edmund didn't merely neglect an orphanage's funding by accident. He redirected money meant to keep 12 children fed and sheltered into keeping one particular secret buried. His own son, hidden away like an embarrassment, while 11 other children nearly starved as collateral to the arrangement. We don't know that for certain. Not yet. Don't we? Something in Gabriel's voice had gone flat and dangerous in a way Evelyn had rarely heard from him. Pratchett fled the moment he learned the children were found. A boy with his ring's description and no parish record. Funds vanishing 18 months ago, precisely when Edmund's debts began, by his own admission to me at the time. Evelyn, I have spent a year sending my brother money to solve problems he would not name, while a child of his blood slept on a stone floor 2 miles from this house. He would have said more, would very likely have ridden out after Pratchett or Edmund or both within the hour, had a small voice not spoken from the study doorway. Daniel stood there, still wrapped in Gabriel's greatcoat, having clearly followed the raised voices through the house with the silent instinct of a child well practiced in knowing when adults were discussing something that concerned him. Is he coming back for me? The boy asked. The man with the ring. Is that why you're both so angry? Evelyn was across the room before Gabriel had fully registered the boy's presence, kneeling to bring her eyes level with his. No one is angry with you, Daniel. Not for one moment. Do you understand me? Margaret says he paid for us to be kept quiet about me. That's why the roof never got fixed properly, and why the food ran short some months, and why nobody from the parish ever came to check. The boy's composure, which had held through a night of near freezing and a morning of upheaval, finally began to crack at the edges. I didn't want anyone to go hungry because of me. You did not cause this, Gabriel said, crouching now as well, his voice steadier than he felt. A grown man made a choice to hide you rather than claim you, and to let other children go without, rather than risk being found out. That is his shame to carry. Daniel, not yours. Not for one single day of your life. It was, Gabriel realized even as he said it, a promise he had no true power yet to keep. Not until Edmund was found. Not until the truth of the boy's parentage was confirmed beyond a frightened girl's memory of a ring. Not until 11 other children's futures were secured beyond the charity of one impulsive morning. But he meant it in the marrow of his bones nonetheless, and something in Daniel's face, some fractional loosening of a vigilance the boy had likely worn since the night he was first left at Blackmere Hollow, told Gabriel the promise had been heard, if not yet fully believed. Behind them, Evelyn had gone very still, watching her husband make to a stranger's child a vow of protection more immediate and unconditional than she had, in 4 years of marriage, ever heard him make to anyone at all. And in that stillness, something that had been quietly hardening in her over the long, cold months of being told which concerns were and were not hers to hold, began, just slightly, to soften. Edmund arrived at Ashworth House 2 days later, unsummoned, his good coat mud-spattered from hard riding, and his face already arranged into the particular expression of a man who has decided upon his story before anyone has thought to ask him a question. He did not get the chance to use it. Gabriel met him in the entrance hall rather than the study. A deliberate choice, made with Evelyn's quiet counsel the night before, because a study door could be closed and a confrontation contained, while an entrance hall left a man nowhere to retreat, except back out into the weather he'd just escaped. "Where is Pratchett?" Gabriel said. No greeting, no pretense of brotherly warmth. Something flickered behind Edmund's eyes. Calculation, quickly suppressed. "I've no idea what you mean." He fled the estate the morning I found 12 children half frozen in a building the parish swore was empty. Funds meant for their keep have been missing for 18 months. And a girl of 11 described quite precisely a ring she watched a well-dressed man wear the night he left a boy at that orphanage's door and told them all never to speak of it. Edmund's composure did not shatter all at once. It went instead the way ice goes on a pond in early spring, a single crack first, followed swiftly by 100 more, until the whole surface simply could not hold the weight any longer. "You don't understand what it would have meant," he said, and his voice had lost the practiced ease of a moment before. "If it came out. A byblow, Gabriel, with a chambermaid from an inn near Reading. It would have ruined any chance I had of marrying well, of restoring anything of my own fortune. Father's debts nearly took the whole estate once already. You know that better than anyone. I couldn't. You could have brought him here." Gabriel's voice did not rise, which somehow made the words land harder than shouting could have. "You could have told me the truth 18 months ago, and I would have found a way to see him fed and safe without one particle of scandal touching your name. Instead, you hid him in a condemned building, bribed a steward to bury the evidence in false accounts, and let 11 other children go hungry and cold as the price of your secret. 11 children, Edmund, who had nothing whatsoever to do with your shame, nearly died 2 nights ago because you valued your reputation above their lives. I didn't know it had gotten so bad. Pratchett told me the arrangement was managed, that the parish had. You didn't ask." Evelyn's voice, from the stairway landing, cut cleanly through his excuse before he could finish building it. She descended slowly, Daniel's hand held firmly in her own. The boy's chin lifted with a courage Gabriel suspected he'd learned from her over these past 2 days, rather than been born with. "You didn't ask, because asking would have meant knowing. And knowing would have meant you couldn't tell yourself it was managed any longer." Edmund's eyes found the boy, and whatever hardness had carried him through the confrontation until that moment finally, entirely, gave way. "Daniel," he said, and the name broke somewhere in the middle. "You left me there." The boy's voice was steadier than Gabriel would have believed possible. "You said you'd come back. You never came back." There was no answer to that, which would not have sounded like precisely the excuse it was. And to his credit, Edmund did not attempt one. He crossed the hall instead, and dropped to one knee before his son for the first time in the boy's memory of him. And whatever passed between them in the silence that followed belonged, Gabriel decided, to the 2 of them alone, and not to any accounting of debts, funds, or family honor. The weeks that followed untangled themselves with considerably less drama than the night that had begun them, though not without cost. Pratchett was found in Bristol, the missing funds largely recovered from an account he had been too frightened to fully empty, and handed over to the magistrate with a thoroughness that left no room for the estate's reputation to soften on his behalf. Edmund did not escape judgment either, though the judgment he faced was quieter, and in its way, harder to bear. A full accounting of his debts settled in exchange for guardianship of Daniel, formally and publicly acknowledged, no chambermaid's son hidden away any longer, but a nephew introduced into Ashworth's own nursery, alongside 11 other children the Duke and Duchess had, with considerably less debate than anyone in the county expected, simply decided to keep. It was Margaret who asked, one evening some months later, settled by the nursery fire with Alice already asleep against her shoulder, whether the Duchess had known, that first frozen night in Blackmere Hollow, with the roof half fallen and the storm still climbing outside, whether she had known she might die there with them, and had gone anyway. Evelyn considered the question with the same seriousness she gave every question these children asked her now, having learned in a ruined nursery that seriousness was the one thing they had gone too long without. "I knew it was possible," she said, "but I had already found you all. And I could not make myself walk back out that door and leave 12 children to face a storm alone, simply because staying might cost me something." Even though his grace didn't know where you were? Even though it might have cost you everything? Evelyn glanced across the room to where Gabriel sat with Daniel's slate propped against his knee, patiently working through sums with a boy who, 4 months ago, had not been permitted to exist in any ledger at all. "Especially then," she said quietly. "Some things are worth more than being asked permission first." Gabriel, without looking up from the slate, reached over and found her hand and held it in front of the fire. In front of the children, in front of a household that had spent 4 years believing it understood its Duke and Duchess, and was only now beginning to learn how wrong it had been. And neither of them let go for a long while after,